On Monday, July 13, 2026, the world lost Sam Neill. He was 78. Word came first from his own family, in a short statement posted to Instagram, and within hours it had traveled everywhere. New Zealand, Australia, Hollywood, and every corner of the internet where people had grown up watching him outrun a T-Rex or steady a submarine crew or play the driest, funniest uncle in New Zealand cinema. But the tribute that people kept coming back to wasn't from a studio executive or a head of state, even though those came too. It was from a woman who had known him since she was 18 years old, Nicole Kidman. This is the story of that friendship, where it started, what it survived, and why, decades later, it still meant enough to Kidman that she made sure the world knew exactly who Sam Neill had been to her. Kidman didn't do television interviews or emotional video statements in the days after Neill's death. She did what she has generally done throughout her career when something is genuinely personal. She gave a short, plainly worded statement to a newspaper, in this case the Sydney Morning Herald, and let the words carry the weight themselves. She said she was immensely saddened by the news. Then she described Neill simply as one of the greats, a joy to be around, charming, kind, funny, and intelligent, and said her heart went out to his family. The line that mattered most, though, was about how they met. Kidman recalled that she was 18 when she and Neill first crossed paths, and that he took me under his wing, beginning a friendship that lasted the rest of his life. It's worth sitting with how ordinary that sentence sounds, and how extraordinary it actually is in an industry that runs on people meeting on a set, working intensely for a few months, and then largely losing touch once the film wraps and everyone scatters to the next job. Kidman wasn't describing a colleague she respected. She was describing someone who mattered to her personally for 37 years. To understand why that mattered, you have to go back to 1989 and a film called Dead Calm. Kidman was a barely known Australian actress when she was cast as Ray Ingram, a young wife who ends up trapped on a boat in the middle of the ocean with her husband and a dangerous stranger. Neill played her husband, John. It was directed by Philip Noyce, and it would go on to be remembered as the film that launched Kidman's career on an international stage. At the time, though, none of that was guaranteed. She was a teenager carrying one of the two lead roles in a tense, physically demanding thriller, opposite an actor who already had a decade of film work behind him across New Zealand and Australia. That kind of imbalance, a rising unknown paired with an established professional, can go a lot of different ways on a set. It can be intimidating. It can be isolating. It can quietly end a young actor's confidence before her career even gets going. By Kidman's own account, that isn't what happened. Neill treated her like she belonged there. The relationship that grew out of those months on Dead Calm didn't fade the way most on-set relationships do once a production wraps. 3 decades later, in 2019, the two of them ended up on a Big Little Lies panel together alongside Laura Dern, an event covered more like a reunion of old friends than a scheduled industry appearance, because by that point their history together had stopped being unusual to the people who knew them. Hollywood is not generally built for long friendships. Careers move people to different cities, different productions, different circles, 4 years at a stretch. The fact that Kidman and Neill remained close for close to 4 decades, without needing to work together constantly to stay in touch, is part of what made her tribute land the way it did. She wasn't alone in describing him that way, either. In the days after his death, tribute after tribute from people across very different corners of his career used strikingly similar language. Steven Spielberg, who directed Neill as paleontologist Dr. Alan Grant in Jurassic Park, called him exceptionally collaborative and noted how strange it had felt directing someone so warm in real life to play a character irritated by children on screen. Laura Dern, his Jurassic Park and Big Little Lies co-star, spoke of a lifelong friendship built on loyalty and protectiveness, delivered with what she called his driest wit. Jeff Goldblum posted a short farewell referencing their years as part of what he called their Jurassic family. Cillian Murphy, who played opposite him in Peaky Blinders, said Neill was one of the kindest, gentlest people he had worked with. Toni Collette, who acted alongside him on 2 separate films years apart, called him the most beautiful, decent gentleman she had known. Karl Urban, a fellow New Zealander, credited him with helping build his country's film industry into what it is today. Even heads of government weighed in. New Zealand Prime Minister Christopher Luxon wrote that Neill had taken New Zealand's stories to the world for more than 50 years, helping build the country's film industry from almost nothing. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese described him as wry and dry, thoughtful and laconic, and said he had faced illness with the same dignity and humor that defined his performances. None of these tributes led with Jurassic Park, despite it being the role that introduced him to the widest possible audience. Almost all of them led with the same handful of words: kind, funny, loyal, gentle. Kidman's tribute simply happened to be the one that reached furthest back, to a version of Sam Neill that existed before almost anyone else in that wave of tributes had met him. Sam Neill wasn't born Sam Neill. He entered the world as Nigel John Dermot Neill in Omagh, Northern Ireland, in 1947. His family moved to New Zealand's South Island when he was 7, after his father, himself a New Zealander, left the army. At school, surrounded by other boys also named Nigel, he switched to Sam, a name, he later said, that simply sounded friendlier. He described his younger self, in his own words, as a nerdy, stuttering kid who wasn't particularly athletic. His early exposure to performing came through school plays, and his real break arrived in 1977 with Sleeping Dogs, a low-budget production that was the first feature film made in New Zealand in over a decade. It helped prove a national film industry could exist at all, and it opened the door to the roles that would eventually take him across Australia, the UK, and Hollywood. In the years that followed, Neill built one of the more varied careers in modern film: a submarine officer in The Hunt for Red October, a grieving husband opposite Holly Hunter in Jane Campion's Oscar-winning The Piano, a menacing gang leader in Peaky Blinders, and a beloved, curmudgeonly uncle in Hunt for the Wilderpeople, a role many of his fellow New Zealanders considered his most personally cherished. He was knighted in New Zealand in 2022 for his contribution to film. Underneath the warmth so many people described this past week, Neill had spent years fighting something serious. He first revealed his diagnosis publicly in his 2023 memoir, Did I Ever Tell You This?, disclosing that he had stage 3 angioimmunoblastic T-cell lymphoma, a rare and aggressive blood cancer, first diagnosed in March 2022. He was candid about it in a way that surprised people used to celebrities keeping serious illness private. He told reporters that chemotherapy had, at one point, stopped working, and that he genuinely didn't know if he would come through it. He later qualified for a clinical trial using CAR T-cell therapy, an approach that reprograms a patient's own immune cells to target cancer more precisely than conventional chemotherapy. In April 2026, he told reporters the treatment had worked. He was cancer-free. Around that same period, he spoke about being not remotely afraid of dying, while also being clear that he had things left he wanted to do. More time with his grandchildren, more years on the New Zealand property where he grew olive trees and cypress, maybe one more film. He kept working throughout his treatment rather than stepping back from public life, including releasing an environmental documentary in early 2026 opposing a proposed industrial gold mine near his home in central Otago, where he had run a small winery, 2 paddocks, since 1993. Neill died on July 13, 2026, in Sydney, at St. Vincent's Private Hospital, surrounded by family. His family's statement described the loss as sudden and unexpected, but said they were comforted by the fact that he remained cancer-free at the time of his death. They thanked the hospital staff by name and asked for privacy as they processed what they called an immeasurable loss. Days later, his longtime agent, Philip Grentz, confirmed publicly that Neill had died of pneumonia, saying he wanted to correct inaccurate reporting that had circulated after the family's initial statement. He is survived by his 4 children, Elena, Tim, Maiko, and Andrew. It would have been easy for Nicole Kidman to issue a brief, generic statement, the kind that gets released through a publicist and forgotten within a day. She didn't. She reached back to a specific age, 18, and a specific act of kindness from a much more established co-star toward a teenager who had every reason to feel out of her depth on that boat in 1989. That detail is the whole story, really. Not a dramatic reveal, not a breakdown, not a secret finally told. Just a woman naming, plainly and publicly, the person who helped shape how she experienced an industry that doesn't always treat newcomers with that kind of care. In an outpouring of tributes that used almost identical words, kind, funny, loyal, gentle, Kidman's was the one that reached back the furthest, to the very beginning of both of their careers, and found the same man there that everyone else was describing at the end of his. Sam Neill spent 5 decades building a body of work that ranged from paleontologists to submarine officers to Peaky Blinders gangsters to a grumpy, beloved uncle in the New Zealand bush. But if the last week has shown anything, it's that almost none of the people who worked with him wanted to talk about the roles first. They wanted to talk about the man. Nicole Kidman just happened to have known him the longest. Sources: The Sydney Morning Herald, NZ Herald, The Spin-Off, Fox News, Yahoo/The Blast, Deadline, Consequence, Hello Magazine, Variety, statements from Christopher Luxon and Anthony Albanese.